So this is the first lecture in the third week, and today what I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about what redistribution of wealth is, like what sort of practices fall under it, and what we might initially think justifies the redistribution of wealth from the rich to the poor, the problems with that initial justification, and then I'll touch on quick how Rawls thinks he can fix this, so how Rawls thinks we can justify the redistribution of wealth, and how Nozick thinks that this is impossible, so he's going to object to Rawls's view. And so this is going to be a pretty quick lecture, and next time what I'll do is discuss Rawls, and then after that, Nozick. First, I'm going to discuss what exactly redistribution is. So there's many practices that we take to be redistributive, and we just need to be clear on what exactly these are. So generally, there are the following sort of types, and I've listed them, of redistribution that we do in modern society. There could be others, but these are just the ones that are prominent. So the first is the direct cash transfer. So in such cases, we simply take money from the wealthier people, whatever segment that is, whatever we decide to do for that segment, and give it to the poorer segment. So, in the past, welfare programs were often direct cash transfers. Now they are constrained cash transfers after the form of the welfare system in the 1990s. A lot of these programs became more constrained, and what that means is that people can only spend their money on a certain set of goods. So in a direct cash transfer, because it's cash, the poor are able to spend their money on anything. With a constrained cash transfer, they must pick from some set of goods that we take to be helpful for them, getting out of their poverty. And so, the thought is that, people should only be spending this money, which comes from other people, right? So that they didn't, supposedly earn themselves on certain goods to help themselves prosper. And so, in that way, we sort of specify certain ends that they should be pursuing to get out of poverty. And so that relates to the direct transfer of goods. This is the second type of transfer. And in this sort of transfer, what we do is we actually just purchase goods. So we take the money from the wealthier, purchase these goods, and give to the poorer. And so this sort of merges in certain ways with direct cash transfers, which are constrained because oftentimes what we do is we just give the money to the poor and have them get the goods instead of us procuring the goods, except they can only buy certain things. And so these are a lot of the sort of classically welfare transfers, and this is what most people think of redistribution of wealth. However, the third kind that I have is where a lot of the redistribution comes from. This is the maybe the dominant, where most of the money is redistributed, and that's in how we support public services. So to use a sort of perfect example with education in the District of Columbia, a lot of richer people do not send their children to public school. They send their children to private school. However, they are the ones supporting most of the public education programs. So their money, which is taxed at a high rate, and there's just a lot more of it, right, because they make so much, is used to fund the public schools, which are populated mostly by children from middle to lower income class, lower to middle incomes. And so in this way, because lower to middle income groups could not support the sort of educational system that is in existence, the rich are in fact supporting something they don't use very much. So this is a redistribution of wealth by supporting programs that they don't need or they don't use. The rich could simply set up, and in fact they do through private schools, set up schools for themselves, leave the poor out, and by doing that they would save a lot of money. So it's not in their direct interests to support public schools, but they're forced to through taxation. So in another way, we also tax people at different rates based upon their incomes. So people who are are of higher incomes are taxed at a much higher rate than people with low incomes. And in fact, low income people pay almost no taxes. And so because of this, because we have a what is called a progressive tax system, where people who have high incomes pay a lot more, this is, in a sense, a redistribution of wealth from the rich to the poor. And so these are the major ways in which we redistribute wealth, and that's what we'll be talking about in this class. So what we aren't concerned with are voluntary redistribution. So what we don't really care about, and what is really unproblematic, is something like charity. So people, can, if they want, give their money to poor people. So rich people can give their money to poor people if they want. But this is completely voluntary. And so it's really not morally problematic. So we can just leave that aside. Charity is fine. That's not what we're really concerned with. Secondly, we're not really concerned with redistribution that is simply correcting past wrongs. So, say someone stole property from someone 10 years ago, from another person 10 years ago, or did something to them such that they lost wages or something. We might want to redistribute some of the wealth from the person who wronged the other person to the wronged individual. So, to the person who has experienced problems because of what was done to them. That also seems unproblematic. I mean, it's just part of what a justice system does. It sometimes transfers wealth from people who have committed crimes or have done, different wrong things to those who have been wronged. And so we're also going to set that aside. And it might be a difficult question what cases these are, and especially with Nozick, we'll see that much of his theory relies upon the fact that there haven't been many injustices in the past that have caused different levels of income and wealth. But let's just set this aside for now. So today what I'm going to be concerned with is whether we can think cooperative redistribution is what we should do, and whether this cooperative redistribution covers a lot of what happens in modern societies. So notice that cooperative redistribution is different from voluntary redistribution. So voluntary redistribution is when a person, under their own volition gives money to another person. Cooperative redistribution is, as I've put here, an act when the transfer would benefit all involved. So the rich person is not voluntarily giving up their money, but because we know that the transfer would benefit them as well as the poorer person, so everyone will be better off, then this is said to be cooperative, and perhaps this is justified. So the question we have to ask is whether redistribution usually or always benefits rich people as well as poor people. And there's some reason to think that it does. So we can sort of cast redistributive programs in the sort of light where it seems like, man, they do seem to benefit everyone. They're just better overall for everyone. They're programs that we should have, not because of any obligations we have to the poor or the rich have to the poor, but because they help everyone. So for instance, you might take a standard social welfare program and see the sort of ways in which it benefits everyone involved. So for instance, social insurance. So take some sort of standard welfare program where we give money to the poor, and in the hopes that this allows them to get out of poverty and maintain a life. We can think of this as social insurance. So what I mean by this is that you pay into insurance because you think maybe someday in the future something bad is going to happen to me, and I'll need money. And in the same way, you might think a welfare program provides what is called a safety net. So we might want a safety net so that I'm sure now, even though I'm rich, I'm sure in the future I won't be, in need of food, essentially. There's only a certain level that I can fall to, and then the state will take care of me. So this reduce risk, and people always want to reduce risk. So that might be the first benefit. Also, you might think there's economic benefits to a social welfare program. So for instance, parts of welfare programs are like job training, or allowing people to have a certain amount of money so they can focus on getting a job or focus on training. If they're concerned about what they're going to eat tomorrow, they obviously cannot devote any time to getting ready for a job or being better at a job. And so you might think this would produce a better workforce, which would be best, good for the owners of companies as well as the employees. And it also, we also have to think about the economy is not really a zero-sum game. So the idea is that if you give certain opportunities to people, people who might be poor, it's not like they'll be competing with you directly necessarily. What they might do is make their own wealth, right? So we think that when people have opportunities, they are able to make wealth that is good for everyone, not just competing for wealth with people. So as we read, Mullich thought that we should think of cities as zero-sum games, right? If one group of people got something, another group of people something was taken from another group of people. So there always has to be a transfer from one person to another, or one group from another. We can never create more wealth. And that sort of goes against what we usually think about, why is capitalism good? Why, what do we think of in economics typically? Well, it's that people are really able to make wealth, and it's not just that we steal it from someone else or we take it from someone else. If I'm doing stuff that's really great and I can trade with people, it doesn't mean it's taking from another person. So it seems like there might be economic benefits. And also, in a more cynical sort of way, you might think a welfare system is cheaper than having police to sort of keep the rich people safe from these incredibly impoverished individuals who have nothing to lose, in a sense, right? So if we let people become so poor that they need food, they have no hope of ever advancing in society, then they certainly have no reason not to commit crimes. So if poor people really have no way of getting out of poverty or no way of getting ahead, it becomes rational to commit crime. It becomes rational to try to take something from the rich. And so you might think a social welfare program gives people reasons not to do that. So it gives people reasons to refrain from crime. And, because they can advance in society if they, supposedly if they work hard. However, we have some good reason to think this is all false, or at least some of it is false. That actually the rich do not have very good reason to give their money to the poor. And we can look at this in a few ways. So, going back to the previous slide, I gave sort of three general categories of ways in which a welfare program might benefit the rich as well as the poor. Here I'm going to show that there's doubts about these, so it's not clear that this can be used to justify the welfare state. So it seems like, yes, the rich could enter into a social insurance program with everyone in society, but that is a lot more expensive than entering into an insurance program with just the rich. So those who are currently rich have a far lower probability of ever becoming extremely poor. People who are born poor or who are poor, by the time they're out of high school are very likely to continue to be poor, whereas rich people are far less likely to be poor in the future. And, as we know with insurance, it's always better to be in a pool with people who are at low risk of actually, having something happen, right? So, for instance, with car insurance, you pay more if you are accident prone, right? So, if you had a pool of very good drivers who always drove the speed limit, everyone's premiums would be much lower. And so car insurance companies charge people different rates based upon how good of a driver they are, or as it happens, how old they are. So people who are, under 21 or whatever, or under 23, I'm not sure, are thought to be a riskier driver, and so they're given higher rates. And in a similar way, because poor people are at higher risk of being poor in the future and needing assistance than rich people, the rich people could get away with a cheaper social insurance program than if they included the poor. And so this makes us doubt that really the rich should get into a social insurance program with the poor. So also, so you might think job training might benefit all people. So the fact that there's trained employees in the country might benefit the owners of companies as well as the employees. But this might only cover very few welfare programs. So, only those related directly to the economy. And so, sort of quality of life welfare programs, like housing programs, making sure that everyone lives in a decent home. It seems like the rich might not have incentive to provide these sorts of things. And so, if we had a welfare system which only had elements which were justified by cooperative redistribution, this would be a constrained set, right? So we'd only have things like job training. We only have things, maybe like providing subsidized loans to students or something. But many things wouldn't be included. For instance, housing programs or other, medical programs. Things for seniors, because seniors, especially if they're retired or can't work, why should the rich care about them? Why should people in the economy really care about them? Because they're not doing anything productive, I think. And so, so that it seems like we also have doubts about that one. And also, whether it's really better to provide a welfare system than having just more police. I mean, we might have some doubts about this. So, although this is probably the most plausible idea here, that the rich don't want to live in a society where there's always people trying to attack them or something because they have nothing to lose, right? If they're extremely poor, you might also think they don't want to live in a society where they see all these poor people. But rich people do make attempts at this. So it's very, gated communities are very common in the United States now. So it's very common for rich people, and this has always been common for rich people, just to go somewhere else, go away from the poor people. If they don't want to see them, if they don't want to be bothered by them, then they can go into a protected community with walls, with security. And this keeps them protected from the poor who have nothing, who want their stuff and have nothing to lose. You might also think that private police services might be very effective if they're really only meant to serve their clients, mainly the rich people. So say we didn't have any public police services, we didn't redistribute. If we just allowed the rich people to buy their own police service, and those police services jobs were really just to protect the rich from the poor, they could, their methods would be completely different. They would never go into the poor neighborhoods. They would never respond to any calls of distress from poor people. They would only care about what their clients' interests were. And, this would be a horrible system, right? I mean, you'd have some terrible things happening in these slums that, where you had terrible poverty, but it seems like the rich might be fine. They'd be protected by the private police force and away from the troubles of the poor communities. And so this all might give you some doubt that the rich, it's actually in the rich's interest to redistribute wealth. So what this means is that we have to find something else. We have to find some other rationale for redistributing wealth from the rich to the poor. So, basically we need to find some other method to explain why we need to redistribute wealth. The cooperative method doesn't seem to do the job. And so next time, I'm going to talk about John Rawls and he wrote an excerpt that you read comes from his book A Theory of Justice, which was written in 1971, I think. And in here he presents a theory of why we should care about economic inequality. And this is essentially what we're talking about. How do you improve economic inequality? Well, you redistribute wealth from the rich to the poor. And he presents the idea of the original position. So we're to think of these individuals who don't know anything about what their position in society will be, going behind what he calls the veil of ignorance. So they don't know where they'll end up in society, and figure out what a just society would look like. And he thinks they will come up with two principles. So the first is that people should have equal rights, and we'll describe what exactly that means. And the second is that economic inequalities benefit everyone. So he thinks that if we have two possible distributions of wealth, and in one the rich make a lot more money than the poor, and the other the rich are even better off and the poor are a little worse off, or even the poor haven't done anything to benefit, then we should take the one where the rich and the poor both benefit. So this, and I'll describe this more clearly because it's kind of a complicated view, but he thinks that the original position justifies these two, and the second principle will be very controversial, and it'll get us what we need to redistribute wealth. So this will be the justification for it. And then next, we'll discuss Nozick's view from his book that came out shortly after A Theory of Justice, called Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And he objects to Rawls's view, and he thinks that we shouldn't be concerned about the distribution of wealth, which is what Rawls is talking about, but only the transactions that lead up to a certain distribution. So he thinks that as long as people enter into just transactions, then the resulting distribution of wealth is just. And to take that later distribution of wealth and change it would be unjust, or in a sense stealing from the rich, in this very strong sense. It's wrong, it's unjust to do that. And in a sense it violates property rights. And so Rawls' second principle. And so we'll have to see whether that's right. And if that is right, then we're back to square one, and we have to find some sort of justification for redistributing wealth, or decide that we can't. And that'd be a rather difficult position. So yeah, as I was saying, next time I'll cover Rawls, and so do the reading, and I'll see you then.